Now investigators are studying the cockpit voice recorder from the Air India plane, which crashed in the Indian city of Ahmedabad last week. Air India Flight 171 was just 30 seconds into its climb when something went catastrophically wrong. The aircraft suddenly plunged into a medical college hostel, creating a fireball visible for miles. With 274 lives lost and only one miraculous survivor, this tragedy has shaken the aviation world to its core. Was it a deadly maintenance error? Could the pilots have saved everyone? And most terrifying of all, could this happen again on your next flight? The day of the crash, on June 12, 2025, what began as a routine international flight turned into one of the deadliest aviation disasters in recent history. Air India Flight AI-171, a Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner bound for London, crashed shortly after takeoff from Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport in Ahmedabad, India. The aircraft had been airborne for just 30 seconds when disaster struck at precisely 1:38 p.m. local time. Eyewitnesses at the airport reported seeing the aircraft struggle to gain altitude, with its wings failing to flex normally during climb, a critical observation that would later become central to understanding what went wrong. The flight crew managed to transmit a single urgent mayday call before the aircraft stalled, pitched downward, and plummeted toward the densely populated Mayani Nagar district below. Within seconds, the massive jetliner crashed directly into a medical college hostel, creating a devastating fireball as aviation fuel ignited upon impact. The collision and subsequent fire destroyed both the aircraft and significant portions of the building, sending thick plumes of black smoke billowing into the sky that could be seen from miles away. Local residents described hearing a thunderous boom that shook nearby buildings, followed by small explosions as the fire spread. The impact was so violent that large sections of the aircraft disintegrated instantly, scattering debris across several city blocks. For the people on board and dozens more on the ground, what should have been an ordinary Thursday afternoon instead became a moment of unimaginable horror. The crash ultimately claimed 274 lives, everyone aboard the aircraft except for one miraculous survivor, plus 33 people who happened to be in the hostel building when disaster struck from above. As news of the crash spread across India and around the world, the scale of the tragedy began to sink in. This was not just another accident, but one of the worst aviation disasters in a decade. The aircraft and flight details. The aircraft involved in this tragedy was a 12-year-old Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner that had been part of Air India's fleet modernization program following the airline privatization by the Tata Group in 2021. Prior to the Ahmedabad disaster, the 787 Dreamliner had maintained an impressive safety record since entering service in 2009, accumulating over 7 million flight hours across all operators without a single hull loss. This stellar history made the sudden catastrophic failure all the more shocking to aviation experts worldwide. The Dreamliner represented a revolution in aircraft design when first introduced, featuring numerous technological innovations that had made it a popular choice for airlines worldwide. Instead of traditional aluminum, much of its fuselage and wings were constructed from carbon fiber reinforced polymer, lightweight composite materials that allowed for better fuel efficiency and extended range. One of its most recognizable features was its flexible wings, which visibly bend during normal flight to absorb turbulence and provide a smoother ride for passengers. The aircraft was powered by GE Aerospace GEnx engines, known for their reliability and reduced environmental footprint compared to previous generations. For Air India, the Dreamliner fleet had been central to rebuilding its international reputation following years of financial struggles as a state-owned carrier. The airline had been working to position itself as a modern, reliable carrier capable of competing with premier international airlines. Flight AI-171 was operating its scheduled international service from Ahmedabad to London Heathrow, a route that had become increasingly important for Air India as it sought to rebuild its international presence. The flight was carrying 236 passengers and 5 crew members, consisting of 169 Indian nationals, 53 British citizens, 7 Portuguese nationals, and 1 Canadian citizen. Many were traveling for business, education, or to visit family abroad. The aircraft had undergone regular maintenance checks according to schedule, with nothing in its service history suggesting any potential problems before that fateful day. The timeline of events. The events leading to the disaster unfolded with terrifying speed, giving the flight crew virtually no time to respond effectively. At 1:25 p.m., Flight AI-171 completed its pre-flight checks with no anomalies reported. By 1:30 p.m., pushback from the gate began, and at 1:33 p.m., the flight received takeoff clearance for runway 28 at Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport. Everything appeared normal as the aircraft began its takeoff roll, accelerating down the runway as expected. Around 1:37:30 p.m., the aircraft rotated and lifted off, beginning what should have been a routine climb-out. Just 30 seconds later, at exactly 1:38 p.m., the flight crew transmitted their only Mayday call, a single urgent communication with no specific details about what was happening. Within 15 seconds after this call, the aircraft began its fatal descent. By 1:38:45 p.m., less than a minute after the emergency declaration, the Boeing 787 had crashed into the Medical College hostel. This extraordinarily compressed timeline represents one of the most rapid progressions from normal flight to catastrophe in commercial aviation history. For air traffic controllers watching their radar screens, the situation developed with shocking speed. Instead of seeing the expected climbing flight path, they watched as a transponder's altitude readings suddenly stopped increasing before disappearing entirely. The lack of extended communication following the initial Mayday call was particularly telling. In most emergency situations, crews typically have time to specify the nature of their problem and their intentions. The silence that followed suggested that the situation deteriorated so rapidly that the pilots were fully occupied with trying to save the aircraft without even a moment to provide further detail. This absence of information would later complicate investigators' initial work as they tried to piece together what happened in those final critical seconds of flight. The entire sequence from takeoff clearance to impact spanned just over 5 minutes, but the actual emergency lasted less than a minute, hardly enough time for anyone to understand what were happening, let alone fix it. Rescue and recovery operations. When the Dreamliner slammed into the Medical College hostel, it created a scene of apocalyptic destruction that challenged even the most experienced emergency responders. The collision caused partial collapse of the 4-story building, with the aircraft penetrating multiple floors before disintegrating. Within minutes, police, firefighters, and ambulances converged on the scene, but their immediate efforts were hampered by several factors. The intense heat from burning aviation fuel created temperatures so extreme that responders initially couldn't approach closer than 50 meters to the main impact site. Their water cannon seemed almost ineffective against the intensity of the blaze, which was further complicated by the monsoon season's humidity and shifting winds that pushed toxic smoke in unpredictable directions. Streets surrounding the crash site quickly became gridlocked as onlookers gathered and additional emergency vehicles attempted to reach the scene. Local authorities established a security perimeter and began evacuating nearby buildings amid fears of structural damage and the possibility of secondary explosion from ruptured gas lines. Doctors and nurses from nearby hospitals rushed to the scene without waiting to be called, setting up makeshift triage areas in adjacent buildings and streets. However, the grim reality soon became apparent. There were very few injured to treat, as the violent nature of the crash and intense fire left almost no survivors. By nightfall, powerful floodlights illuminated the crash site while the search operation continued without pause. By late Friday evening, officials reported recovering at least 270 bodies, 241 from the aircraft and 29 from the hostel's charred remains. This count would eventually increase to 274 confirmed fatalities, as additional victims on the ground were identified. The recovery operation involved hundreds of personnel working in shifts around the clock, including specialized teams with heavy machinery, structural engineers to assess building stability, and forensic experts to begin the painstaking process of identifying victims. The combination of aircraft wreckage and building debris created a complex, hazardous environment for recovery teams, who had to move cautiously to prevent secondary collapses while still working as quickly as possible. The sole survivor, against overwhelming odds, one person survived the catastrophic crash of Flight AI-171. 23-year-old Vishwas Kumar Romj, seated in 11A, was pulled from the wreckage alive hours after impact. He had suffered severe burns covering much of his body and multiple fractures, including a broken pelvis and femur, but somehow escaped the fate that claimed every other person aboard. Romj's survival was attributed to his specific position in the aircraft near the left-wing root, where a section of the fuselage had remained somewhat intact despite the catastrophic impact. When rescue workers heard faint calls for help coming from beneath a section of torn fuselage, they were astonished to discover Rome's conscious and able to identify himself as a passenger from the flight. From his hospital bed days later, he described his harrowing experience to visiting journalists. He recalled the aircraft suddenly dropping shortly after takeoff, followed by screams throughout the cabin as passengers realized something was terribly wrong. Most vividly, he remembered how the left side of the aircraft crumbled around him during impact, with a door near his seat completely detaching and creating an opening through which he managed to escape the burning wreckage. The young software engineer had been traveling to London for his first-ever job interview outside of India, a trip that represented both professional opportunity and personal adventure. Despite his extensive injuries, doctors expected him to eventually make a full recovery, though they cautioned the process would take many months and multiple surgeries. His hospital room soon filled with flowers, cards, and messages from well-wishers across India and beyond. In an exclusive interview with NDTV, Rome spoke about his experience, though his voice trembled when recalling the sounds of twisting metal and the faces of fellow passengers in their final moments of terror. His miraculous survival offered a tiny flicker of hope amid overwhelming tragedy, becoming a symbol of resilience that resonated with people around the world. The investigation begins. Within hours of the crash, India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, AIB, mobilized one of the largest investigation teams in the organization's history. Understanding the international dimensions of the disaster, they quickly invited specialists from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AIB, to join the effort under provisions of the Chicago Convention that governs international aviation. This multinational approach brought together experts in flight recorder analysis, aircraft structures, power plant systems, human performance, and meteorology, pooling global expertise to uncover what went wrong. Their first priority was locating and securing the critical black boxes, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, that could provide essential insights into the aircraft's final moments. Despite the extensive destruction of the crash site, search teams located the first recorder in the wreckage southeast quadrant on June 13th, just one day after crash. Hours later, they recovered the second recorder from beneath a collapsed beam near the hostel's rooftop. Both devices, though outwardly damaged, were carefully packed in protected containers and transported under security escort to specialized laboratories in New Delhi. Meanwhile, at the crash site, investigators established a grid system for documenting the debris field, photographing and cataloging each significant piece of wreckage before it was moved. This meticulous process would later help them reconstruct the sequence of structural failures and understand how the aircraft broke apart. They collected fluid samples from hydraulic systems and examined control surfaces for evidence of pre-impact damage or malfunction. Investigators interviewed dozens of eyewitnesses, including airport ground crew, air traffic controllers, and local residents who had observed the aircraft's final moments. Their accounts consistently highlighted the unusual appearance of the aircraft during its brief flight, particularly the lack of normal wing flexing that should have been visible during the climb phase. This observation quickly became a focal point for the technical investigation. The timeline for analysis was projected at 2 to 3 weeks, a period of acute anticipation for investigators and families alike. Leading theories and evidence. As data from the flight recorders began to be analyzed, investigators focused on several potential causes, with one theory quickly emerging as particularly compelling. The most likely explanation centered on a problem with the aircraft wing configuration during the critical takeoff phase. Multiple eyewitnesses had reported that Flight AI-171's wings appeared unusually rigid during climb, lacking the distinctive flex that normally characterizes a Dreamliner in flight. Aviation experts, including YouTuber Captain Steve, suggested that the flight crew may have inadvertently retracted the flaps instead of the landing gear after takeoff. Flaps and slats are movable surfaces on aircraft wings that extend during takeoff and landing to provide additional lift at lower speeds. Normally, these high-lift devices remain extended during the initial climb phase, allowing the aircraft to safely ascend while gradually building airspeed. If they retracted too early, before the aircraft had reached sufficient speed, the sudden loss of lift could cause a stall, exactly what witnesses described seeing before the crash. The flap-o-slap mechanism on the 787 is typically governed by 2 independent torque motors and monitored by a dedicated position encoder system. This redundant design makes complete failure extremely rare, leading investigators to consider whether maintenance issues might have resulted in a system that gave false readings to the cockpit, potentially showing flaps as extended when they had actually retracted. The technical challenge of this theory was explaining how such a critical error could occur in an aircraft with multiple safeguards against precisely this type of mistake. Modern airliners have warning systems designed to alert pilots if flight controls are improperly configured. Investigators began exploring whether mechanical malfunction in the flap system itself might have contributed to the disaster. Notably, investigators quickly ruled out several potential causes. Weather was eliminated as a factor, as the day had been clear with standard temperature and pressure and no significant wind shear. Similarly, radar scans showed no bird flocks in the departure corridor, and preliminary engine examinations revealed no evidence of foreign object damage. Maintenance records and technical factors. A deeper examination of maintenance records revealed potential issues that might have contributed to the disaster. The left wing's flap actuator had been serviced just 1 month before the crash, but quality control sign-offs had been delayed by a week due to spare part shortages. This finding raised serious questions about whether maintenance issues might have resulted in a system malfunction. Investigators began tracing the supply chain for these replacement parts, examining whether they met original equipment manufacturer specifications and had been properly installed and tested. The maintenance delay itself wasn't necessarily unusual in the industry, but the combination of a recent service intervention on a critical flight control system and the subsequent catastrophic failure warranted thorough examination. Maintenance personnel who had worked on the aircraft were interviewed extensively about the procedures they followed and any anomalies they might have observed. Crystal Jen, an independent safety analyst, emphasized that despite rigorous automated safeguards in modern jets, a momentary misconfiguration at the wrong phase of flight could prove catastrophic. The extremely compressed time frame of the accident, from liftoff to impact in less than a minute, suggested that whatever went wrong happened almost immediately and progressed too quickly for the crew to diagnose and correct. Aviation consultants Keith Tonkin and lawyer Peter Carter highlighted the bewildering speed of events, noting that the timeline from takeoff roll to impact spanned barely half a minute, leaving scant margin for corrective action. Investigators were particularly interested in the flight data recorder information that would show the actual position of the wing surfaces during the flight, as well as any warnings or alerts that might have appeared in the cockpit. They hoped to determine whether these systems functioned as designed, whether any warnings were generated but ignored or misinterpreted, or whether the safeguards themselves had somehow failed. The investigation would methodically analyze each component of the flap system, including hydraulic lines, control motors, position sensors, and the electronic interfaces that connect these systems to the cockpit display. The team also examined the aircraft's warning systems to understand why, if the flaps were indeed improperly configured, the pilot apparently received no alert about this dangerous condition. Impact on families and identification challenges. The human toll of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate casualty count. For each of the 274 victims, there were dozens of family members and friends suddenly thrust into unimaginable grief. The days following the crash were particularly agonizing as many families face uncertainty about whether their loved ones had actually been on the flight, followed by the torturous wait for identification confirmation. Air India established a family assistance center at a hotel near Ahmedabad airport, where relatives gathered hoping for news. The scene there was heart-wrenching. Parents clutching photographs of adult children who had been traveling for education or work, spouses anxiously checking their phones for updates, young children not fully comprehending why everyone were crying. The identification process itself presented enormous challenges. Many victims were rendered unrecognizable by the severity of the crash and resulting fire. Officials established DNA testing facilities that operated around the clock, working to match samples submitted by relatives with recovered remains. Blood samples, dental records, and personal effects became crucial tools in the identification process. For many families, the wait for confirmation stretched on for days, adding to their trauma and grief. Cultural and religious considerations added further complexity, as many Indian traditions call for cremation within 24 hours of death, a timeline impossible to meet given the identification challenges. Religious leaders work with families to navigate these difficulties, offering modified ceremonies and special dispensations while respecting the scientific necessities of the investigation. Social media became both a source of community support and a platform for expressing collective grief. Hashtags like #PrayForAhmedabad and #JusticeForAI171 trended for days on Indian and British platforms, with users sharing memories of loved ones lost and calling for thorough investigations. These online communities provided a space where those affected could connect with others experiencing similar loss, transcending geographical boundaries. In Ahmedabad itself, makeshift memorials appeared almost immediately. City squares filled with flowers, candles, and photographs as residents came together to mourn not only the passengers but also the 33 people killed on the ground, medical students and staff who had been in the hostel when disaster struck from above. Corporate and regulatory response. For Air India and the Tata Group, the crash represented not just a human tragedy but an existential business crisis requiring swift and decisive action. The airline's leadership team faced a delicate balance of expressing genuine compassion for victims while protecting the company's future. They quickly announced compensation of 1 Indian rupee crore, approximately $120,000, for the families of each deceased passenger, alongside coverage of medical expenses for the sole survivor. This immediate financial response, while unable to address the emotional devastation, at least removed some practical burden from grieving families. Behind the scenes, Air India executives coordinated with the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, DGCA, pledging complete transparency and cooperation with the investigation. Meanwhile, India's aviation authorities implemented sweeping safety measures across the industry. The DGCA ordered immediate inspections of all 34 Boeing 787 Dreamliners in the Indian commercial fleet, focusing particularly on flap systems, electronic engine controls, and takeoff configuration parameters. Aviation Minister Ram Mohan Naidu emphasized that these extended surveillance measures were preventative rather than suggestive of any known fleet-wide issue. The Directorate General of Civil Aviation, DGCA, promised full transparency in its updates, releasing daily bulletins on debris distribution, fluid sample analyses, and cockpit simulation reconstructions. For Boeing and GE Aerospace, the engine manufacturer, the crash created significant challenges. Both companies dispatched technical teams to Ahmedabad to assist with the investigation while simultaneously reviewing fleet-wide data from other 787 operators around the world, looking for any anomalies in flap system performance that might indicate a wider problem. Boeing stock futures plunged nearly 9% in the wake of the crash, reflecting investor concerns about potential design or manufacturing issues with the 787 Dreamliner, though the aircraft had previously enjoyed an excellent safety record. Memories of earlier problems with the 737 MAX heightened anxiety about possible systemic issues. Analysts warned that Air India's insurance premiums and passenger confidence would likely suffer, while Boeing faced fresh scrutiny over the 787's flight control software and GE over its GEng's engines. International reactions and support. The crash of Flight AI-171 generated waves of sympathy and offers of assistance from governments worldwide. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called it a day of profound sorrow and ordered flags on government buildings lowered to half-mast in honor of the 53 British citizens who lost their lives. He also dispatched a team from the British High Commission to aid local authorities with identification and repatriation of remains. The British royal family observed a moment of silence during the Trooping the Colour ceremony, with members wearing black armbands to honor the victims. This gesture, broadcast internationally, helped communicate the magnitude of the tragedy to a global audience. Canadian and Portuguese officials similarly expressed grief over their lost citizens, dispatching consular teams to assist families and participate in the investigation. International aviation organizations mobilized substantial resources to support the investigation and consider potential industry-wide implications. The International Civil Aviation Organization convened a special session to discuss the crash and potential safety lessons, while industry groups like the International Air Transport Association offered technical expertise and resources to Indian authorities. Foreign media coverage reflected the global impact of the disaster, with major news networks maintaining continuous coverage in the days following crash. International news teams descended on Ahmedabad, broadcasting updates as a recovery and investigation progressed. This global spotlight increased pressure on investigators to provide timely updates while maintaining investigative integrity. For the families of non-Indian victims, the international response provided both support and complications. While appreciating the expressions of solidarity from their governments, many face complex logistical and legal challenges navigating a disaster that occurred thousands of miles from home. Questions about jurisdiction for compensation claims and differences in liability laws across countries added additional complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Diplomatic staff found themselves serving as intermediaries between grieving families and the investigation team, translating not just language but also cultural approaches to disaster management and victim treatment. Historical context and aviation safety. The crash of AI-171 marked India's deadliest aviation accident since the Chakki-Dadri Midday collision in 1996, which claimed 349 lives when a Kazakhstan Airlines Aviation Illinois 76 collided with a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 over northern India. That earlier disaster had led to significant reforms in air traffic control procedures and the mandatory installation of traffic collision avoidance systems, TCAS, in commercial aircraft operating in Indian airspace. Aviation experts drew comparisons between the Ahmedabad crash and the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crash in 2019, which involved a Boeing 737 MAX. That accident was traced to flaws in the Aircraft Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS, resulting in worldwide groundings and a comprehensive redesign process. These comparisons raise uncomfortable questions about whether other modern aircraft might harbor hidden design vulnerabilities that could manifest in catastrophic ways. The disaster triggered extensive discussions within the aviation community about the balance between automation and human control in modern aircraft. While sophisticated computerized systems have generally improved safety, some experts worry that they might be eroding pilots' abilities to recognize and react when systems fail or provide misleading information. Flight instructor associations began advocating for increased manual flying practice, particularly during critical phases of takeoff and landing. For Indian aviation specifically, the disaster prompted questions about whether regulatory oversight had kept pace with the rapid expansion of commercial aviation in the country. Despite significant modernization in recent years, questions emerged about whether safety culture had been sufficiently prioritized across all levels of the industry. Many call for a renewed commitment to safety as a foundation of further growth, arguing that only through consistent, rigorous oversight could public confidence be maintained. Looking ahead, the investigative committee aimed to issue its interim report within 6 weeks, recommending immediate safety directives based on flight data recorder analyses and preliminary assessments of fractured components. The disaster's lessons would likely shape regulations, design philosophies, and training doctrine for years to come, with safety advocates hoping that the tragedy would catalyze enduring improvements across global aviation. Thanks for watching another episode.